We have talked about the premise of political science, the ideas behind it, the theories behind it, and nationalism, the ideologies that people have, ideas about how to distribute resources, and also the political science part, how we look at that, how we study this. Now, after having spent the first half of the course looking at the foundation of political science and politics, and the ideas, the distribution of resources, there's concepts, and also how democracies and our own government works. This week you had a number of videos and short commentaries to read on some of the most important public policies that pertain to the distribution of resources. Policies such as immigration, healthcare, education, things that all of us will be affected by, no matter how young, no matter how old. Policies that are decided by our elected officials based upon what people want and what interest groups want and what public in general wants or accepts or prefers. So the question then becomes, looking at ourselves and based on first the Friedman-Mandelbaum piece, looking at how we were the envy of the world, how we were exceptional, how we have a lot of advantages and a lot of opportunities still. Other countries do not look at us the way they used to, in the sense that when countries today choose to set up healthcare systems, say when Chile or Taiwan set up their healthcare system, the last country they look at is the United States. When they set up immigration system, the last country they look at is the United States. When people talk about schools, California used to be the envy of the world in the 1950s in terms of high schools. Today, no one says that about high schools in California or anywhere else. If you want to study how middle school and high schools do well, you go to Finland or South Korea or Poland today. And so the question becomes, we have reinvented ourselves so many times before. We've managed to overcome these obstacles. Are we able to do so today? Are we still exceptional in the sense that we've had before, where we believed in ourselves, had this unending optimism? Or is that not applicable anymore? Are we even willing to accept that we have problems? Much of the popular debate today is basically name-calling and mudslinging between the two parties over whether taxes are good or bad, or immigration is good or bad, rather than what is it we want to achieve, and then how are we willing to pay for it. And that tends to take a backseat at best, and most of the time doesn't occur at all. So when Friedman and Mandelbaum starts these pieces that talk about our approach to immigration, to education, to healthcare, to public spending, to the role of private business, they're actually asking, what are we doing to get back to being as a model for others? Are we able to do so? And if we cannot get our public spending in line, if we cannot get education back up, and that's why you're in college, to help improve of the dismal statistics, particularly for male graduates that have gone down, and to stop the dropout rate from high schools. If we can improve on that, if we can improve our immigration policies to attract the best and the brightest, and I will leave it for you to watch the videos as to what the different alternatives are, then we have a real problem in building ourselves back to the place that used to be the envy of the world, that made us exceptional. There's also a varying degree of belief that we are actually superior to or exceptional, unique amongst the younger generation, which we'll see on the slides here shortly as well. And remember, as they mentioned, American power, as Mandelbaum and Friedman points out, somehow it has fallen slightly out of fashion to talk about American power. Those on the left often do not fully understand its constructive uses, concentrating instead on the occasional abuses. Those on the right often do not fully understand its sources. The American power is not simply a matter of will, but of means, and the means must be renewed and refreshed. In other words, we have to rebuild society. We have to adjust. And that means having good education, healthcare, immigration policy, for example, and not coming up with policies that do not work, or sticking in the face of problems, sticking with existing policies and refusing to change. In other words, not being adaptive. One of the hallmarks of the young generation leaving college is that you need to be good in critical thinking, assessing problems, and be adaptive. And the economy needs to be adaptive. Other countries have been forced under duress to change. We have the choice to set our own path for changing immigration and healthcare and related public policies in a way that we can decide, not leaving it to others to force upon ourselves changes, or force upon us changes that we may not prefer or that we do not want. But whether or not we're able to do so very much depends upon your generation, your college-educated students taking an active role in society, expressing your ideas, voting, participating, as we'll get back to later on. So we have these articles and films about skills gaps, about the labor force, about education to go over. And the videos explain very well the different opportunities and alternatives that exist for immigration policies, for healthcare policies. One thing I want to mention, as college-educated citizens, you should never accept simply headlines or 30-second sound bites. And when it comes to labor and immigration and healthcare, there are few countries that have matched the lunacy of some of the statements from the left and the right in the United States. One of the things that when it comes to immigration is this conflagration of illegal and legal immigration. Leaving aside illegal immigration for a second, legal immigration at about 800,000 to 1 million or so a year, roughly thereabouts, comes through a variety of means, as mentioned on the videos as well. But when it comes to one of those things that are very controversial, namely skilled immigrant labor, we really need to be clear about something. April 1st every year, something called an H-1B visas for skilled workers in an American company wanting to hire non-U.S. citizens to come and work. That date on April 1 is when they can do so, when they can apply for one of these visas. Now, in the popular media, this is represented by the left as taking jobs from America, and from the right as there's not enough of these. The truth is, if, for example, Joe owns an American company in Pittsburgh, and he has engineers, software developers, marketers, salespeople, but he can't find the people that he needs who are American citizens, he will be forced to pay equal or higher wages for any foreigner that he wishes to hire. He will have to advertise in publicly available spaces and publications for weeks that he needs to fill this position, and any American that qualifies must be hired if they can find one. After he's gone through the lengthy process, may get a German or an Indian or someone else, he can only keep them for 3 + 3 years. He needs to pay their insurance. He needs to guarantee that he will pay the flight back if they need to leave. And he has to pay them between 0 and 5% more than he would an American, depending on the field. So in other words, if Joe can find an American whom he can hire, it will be cheaper, easier, and better for him under any circumstance than to hire a foreigner. So to say that this is taking away from American jobs is simply factually not true when it comes to H-1B visas, if it is pursued legally. Some other American companies, frustrated with the inability to find American workers for jobs, have even set up subsidiaries abroad to then do internal transfers. Say you have a subsidiary in Belgium or in India, and then internally transfer one of those workers into the United States or more. Now then the wage structure can be very different. But to legally hire someone on H-1B visa, you cannot undercut an American wage at all. So let's just be clear on that part. But when it comes, and you can walk into any hospital, university, other software companies, and other areas in the United States in the private sector, and you can find a lot of skilled immigrant workers who come and work because American employers either really need their skills or can't find equivalent skills of Americans. We also tend not to want to keep those from abroad who come and get university degrees in the United States, because we still have the best universities in the world, or at least half of the top 20 universities in the world in the United States. And we tend not to want to keep them after. So if you come and get an engineering degree, a master's degree, a PhD, a medical degree, and then you're kicked out and end up going back to Ghana or Germany or Chile or Argentina and start your own business and compete with Americans instead of starting it here and hiring Americans. Think about popular companies like Skype and Candy Crush and other software companies that were started in other places, not in the United States. Pandora, for example, as well. They were started abroad. They are not American companies, but we use them today. What if they have been created here and hired those thousands of workers here instead? So there are some discrepancies here and problems in our immigration policy and our labor policy that we need to rectify. So you have come from somewhere else. Do you have dual citizenship, if I may ask? Okay, ask it. So you have, if you have dual citizenship, it's not, you're anywhere in Europe now. So that's a different story. But even there, it depends on where you come from, whether we recognize dual citizenship or not. Something you should also be familiar with that most Americans are not because of our previous dominance in many areas. You can technically have 4 citizenships, depending on where your mother or father are from, where you're born, etc. I met numerous people who have 4 citizenships. Perfectly legal. It's not some spy thriller cheating with false documents. Basically, if your mother is from Israel, you're automatically an Israeli citizen. So that's one. And there are other ways as well. And that opens up doors. But the problem here for American companies is the ability to hire people that they need and want. But how do we change that, or how do we make ourselves competitive? Because not only do skills gaps show up here, and you're here to improve those skills gaps, cut them down, and though it talks a lot about math in here, did anyone notice that the OECD study that Thomas Friedman and Michael Mandelbaum is referring to when they talk about skills gap? If you read that article and open up the actual survey, you'll see that it's not math they're referring to initially. Reading. We have fewer adults in America that can actually follow instructions, written instructions, than most other developed countries. Now that's scary, because in every setting that you will find yourself, in every workplace that you will find yourself, you will have to read instructions, you will have to communicate in writing. And if you can't do that, let alone understand basic mathematical formulas, it's going to be very, very difficult to be adaptive and productive. So cutting back on the reading part and the writing part is actually detrimental to your long-term income. Think about most of the things you do a day. You communicate by what? Verbally or in writing? Huh?
If you're 20 and say verbally, I'm shocked, I can call up Verizon's text message service and show that we have about 18 billion text messages an hour in the United States, and I walk down the hallways here and I don't see any faces other than stuck down in a phone. You apply online, you seek guidance online, you apply for work online, you introduce yourself online, you present your resume in writing, you communicate in writing, and also then you have to understand what is required for a job, for an assignment, for a particular task. So writing and reading are absolutely essential. It goes to comprehension. And that is absolutely essential for employers as well. Most of you are going to have many different jobs in your life. I came from two vastly different fields, or have been in two vastly different fields. Many of you are going to be in 3 or 4 or 5. If not different fields, at least different jobs. So adaptability and ability to comprehend reading and writing is absolutely essential. And the fact is, as some of you have mentioned here, the fact that you are in a world, we like to say that you're so interconnected online, you can know what's going on in the rest of the world instantaneously. But then forget the fact that that very interconnectedness means you're not competing with someone graduating from Lehigh or New York. Most of you will be competing with people from around the world, period. Most of you will be competing with someone sitting in a classroom right now in Bogota or in Buenos Aires or in Brussels or Brisbane. And that's scary for some and really exciting for others. But this notion that you're just competing with those who graduate locally is dead. It's gone. It doesn't exist. I can challenge you to walk into any hospital, any software company, any automobile manufacturing administrative leadership positions, any university, and I think you can you'll see what I mean. And the question then is, how well are you prepared to do so? And how well are we as a country prepared to deal with that if we have an immigration policy where we say, come here, get educated at the best schools in the country and then in the world, and then kick you out? Because what happens with people who get engineering degrees and PhDs in the United States and can't stay? Where do they go? So they go back home to Ghana or England or Argentina or Chile. And what do they do there? They build companies. They compete with American companies instead of building them here and hiring Americans. Yeah, that's what happens. Where do you skip? Just to mention a few prominent companies as we speak, where do you think Skype or Candy Crush or Pandora came from? None of them originated in the United States. And they're not small potatoes today. Or other companies that we can mention as well. But this all comes based on our preferences of what we want to achieve. And this just came out. This came out about 18 months ago. And speaking about American exceptionalism and what we value, this is about asking Americans about whether we think we're superior, whether we think our values are correct, where we think morality comes from. In other words, what do we value and where do we emphasize change going in society? Now, if you look at, for example, our belief in our superiority, in other words, do we think we're better than others? Do we think we are exceptional in a way that's superior to others? In 2002, the clear majority of Americans believed so. 2012, not so. We're rapidly becoming equal to the Germans, Spaniards, and others in terms of whether they think our culture is superior. Now, obviously, what a German considers to be part of their culture, what the Spaniard considers to be part of their culture, may not be the same as what an American considers to be part of their culture. But it's nonetheless telling that other people think, yeah, America is not as alluring as it used to be, and we're pretty darn good on our own because we've taken what we've learned from others and we've adapted it and we've become pretty darn good. And in the case of Germany, it's not too surprising given they've created something of a world record in job creation in the last 10 years with a huge plummet, as a very, very low unemployment, very high output. But look also in terms of where we still believe that our ideas and morality come from. Far more religiously based in the United States. Again, neither a positive or negative, but it's a vast contrast to many of our competitors here in the Western world that share the same otherwise democratic principles. Freedom to pursue one's goal in life are less important in most other countries than having a more egalitarian society. Again, not a value judgment. It is a value judgment by people being asked, but not as an observer, other than there is a bit greater emphasis on equality in other societies than here. It's also very well established that, for example, Christianity in the United States is very individualistic. That's one of the reasons why inequality is tolerated more in the United States, because individualism religion is an individual choice. Even religions that preach compassion and tolerance, that's an individual choice, not a collective responsibility. There's a well-established literature on that. And also, if you look at democratic differences in cultural superiority, your group is a lot less confident in our cultural superiority than your grandparents' group. I'm sort of in the middle. And this is a change, maybe in response to higher unemployment, maybe because wages are stagnating, maybe because roads are crumbling, maybe because a whole host of other reasons. But there's something there that doesn't make people as optimistic or proud or some combination thereof as before. Yes, sir? Why would we think we're superior? Well, that goes to the larger question. Are we exceptional? So you think it's incorrectably that one culture is inferior to another. Remember when we talked about nationalism? And the necessity of a belief in a group of people wanting to be together in order to create a country? That if you think about the social contract, our city, state, and government, federal government, only exists because we want it and accept that those rules are in place. And every year you see countries around the world where people say, we don't accept this system. And governments are overthrown, systems are changed, regimes are put in place other than those that were in place. They happen gradually in democracies, they happen violently in undemocratic systems. But that nation must believe that there's something worth keeping in order to stay together. And if you don't have race as a binding factor, if you don't have territory, if you don't have language, and you don't have religion, and we can find countries where all of those are what keeps the country together, there has to be something else. You said America is full of ideas and values, right? And this is the only democratized, industrialized country that was founded on that rather than any of the others. Today, there's no Western European or Australian or other democracies that are not full of immigrants and first, second generation immigrants, multiple languages, and so on. But they weren't founded and solidified based on that. So if we're solidified on the ideas and values, there has to be a belief that that is somehow unique. And we managed to succeed in a lot of different areas, despite our indefensible, long-time segregation of Native Americans, blacks, and other minority groups. there was a lot of industrial progress, innovation, and so on, right? Then we got that straight finally with those indefensible policies. And there still seems to be some energy, people come, innovations take place, companies emerge, global order is oftentimes restored by U.S. military power, etc. So there seems to be something that people believe is both unique and superior. This is not to say that it is, but there seems to be a belief. And without that, maybe, as I'll get to Matthew in a second, maybe as Thomas Friedman said as a comment in Pay's article that you had to read for the second week, this unbending optimism is actually absolutely essential. To those of you who went to the American Dream Talk, it's no exaggeration to say, as much of the literature shows, without this belief in the American dream, without this belief that there's a better tomorrow, even in the face of factual disagreement or facts showing otherwise, we would be in big trouble. Because a country that was almost torn apart by civil war over slavery, that had indefensible racial segregation up to the late 60s, who had numerous discriminatory policies, who had a bunch of other corruption problems in states. Despite all the success in the country, we've had a huge amount of problems. Despite that, we made this work for a very long time. And there has to be something driving that. Yeah, Matthew, sorry. Okay. So most Americans wake up with thinking we're going to be better for me. That may trickle down to others eventually, but as I'm working hard for me, for my family, that may benefit society. But I'm not waking up thinking I'm going to work better for others. Okay, so you're saying individuals are not responsible for society, but think of this. In the United States, we have more volunteer community organizations per person than anywhere in the world, hands down. We do things through voluntary organizations, through firefighters. Remember, most fire stations in the United States are voluntarily manned, volunteer firefighters. That exists nowhere else. In fact, two Iranian friends, that was the first thing that absolutely baffled them when they moved to the United States. Not the intricacies and lunacies of some issues of baseball. That's my own personal opinion, not. But volunteer firefighters. That was the thing that stuck with them for 10 years. All other things. Because it's expected that that's something that society should pay for. Right? So we have all of these voluntary groups. Okay, so you expect, but you make a very concise and good argument that individuals wake up in the United States thinking, I'm going to better myself. If there are fallouts into society, okay, but I'm going to better myself. That's the individual dream, to improve yourself and your economic and social situation. But at the same time, then, there are a lot of people who, for no other reason than that they want to, take on tasks in society in which, whereas in other societies that's paid for by taxes or some government organization, firefighters, environmental groups, cleanup, scouts, after-school program, you name it. So that seems to counter this notion that everyone's individualistic and the resultants perhaps would be sort of better society. You're also smart enough here to think about this. And you can make your argument very well that you have, but individual rational choices This goes to the collective action problem with air and water and education. What seems rational for one person individually and another person individually and a third person and 300 and 700 and 1,000 people individually may end up being ruinous collectively. Because it makes every sense for one person to take a little bit of community water even though they're not paying for it, or using a little bit more energy. But if everyone does that, you end up with a complete shortage and nobody pays for it. And we used those examples earlier. So there are counter arguments to that as well. Yes, sir. Okay, so we have an individualistic system, but our entire yes, sir. Go ahead. An individualistic system. Human nature. Everyone thinks for themselves. Okay. Then why does society continue to exist? Huh? Let's go first here, then you. Yes, sir. Oh, yes, ma'am. Sorry. Well, people, if you think back to Hobbes and Locke's view of human nature that we talked about, if this is something to go by, and if our number of volunteer organizations is an indication, if our charitable giving, which is far greater than any other country in the world, the private charitable giving, not the public, but the private charitable giving, far greater than anywhere else, that seems to indicate a belief in the goodness of human nature, rather than, and that would be a Lockean view, rather than the Hobbesian view. So it can go both ways. Yes, go ahead. Sorry. Okay. But here's if people aren't selfish, here are the problems that we brought up before about human nature. We can't decide definitively whether we're Hobbesian and self-interest, selfish, greedy, and whatever good comes out of individual self-interest may be a positive externality, or whether we're inherently social and looking out for others and take others into our own interest. There's evidence of both sides. These are more complex examples that you've correctly and very well brought up than the whole, do you lock your car? Because if everyone is good and caring and doesn't steal, nobody would ever lock their car or their home. But obviously people do that. Yet not every car is stolen, not every home is broken into. And chances are if I left my wallet here and left, I could come back in an hour and it would be intact. But there's also a chance that it wouldn't. Yes, sir. Okay. Yep. Okay, so your friend moved to Düsseldorf, Germany, and is better off economically. Not surprising. As I said, Germany, yes. Germany, and it goes to the values allocation. Remember, in the 50s and 60s, we had by far the best high schools and middle schools in the world. The envy. People traveled to California to see what they were doing. We built the interstate highway in the 50s and 60s, and it was a marvel for the world. And yet, today, nobody goes to California or Michigan or Mississippi to look at high schools. They go to Finland, they go to Korea, they go to Australia, they go to Singapore, they go to or other countries. They don't go here. If you want to look at infrastructure projects, you go to Sweden or Germany or China. Yes, not here. So obviously they have prioritized different things. Does it cost money? Yes. But they've collectively decided that it's better to have slightly higher taxes and pay for roads and hospitals and schools than we've chosen to do. And it's not a negative positive, it's a value judgment that we've collectively made. Every time someone from the left or the right brings up spending more or less taxes, the question always becomes, oh, taxes are too high, taxes are too low. Instead of, what is it that we want? That's really what all of these articles and films are about. What is it that we want to prioritize? Do we value having roads that the companies can make use of and private citizens can make use of that are not filled with potholes? Do we value having schools where we do not have a 20% dropout rate from high schools? Or do we not? Do we value having companies that actually thrive under less bureaucracy than in many other countries? Or not? So we have to decide on those, and thus far we've had a long period of very little being done about this. And other countries have said, either under duress, like Southern Europe, or because they realized that it simply didn't work, like Sweden and Germany, and radically transformed their economies, and now have grown 5-6%. So it's a value judgment as to what you want to prioritize, and oftentimes in the American debate, it tends to be very simplistic in terms of higher taxes, lower taxes, you're lying, she's lying, he's lying, government's too big, government's too small, instead of saying, what is it we actually want to do? What is it we want to achieve? And then, how do we pay for it? Seems to be a more productive way of going about it, but that tends to be lost in this partisan bickering. Yes, Matthew? And then, oh yes, no. Germany, and our colleague Dr. Brooks worked there several years as well. And having worked in other Northern European countries, yes, there is an advantage to that, because some of the emphasis in America on individualism, like you correctly pointed out, on hard work, on work ethic, is very useful. However, as studies shown, the productivity level per hour is actually declined in the United States. The college graduation rate has declined. The wages have stagnated. There's a greater gap today between the jobs offered and the skills that graduates have than ever before in U.S. history. So obviously there is something gap mixing. Kira. Well, what Kira brings up is actually supported in the literature about short-sightedness, about a lack of long-term progress, which has worked very well for us. Historically, I mean, think about the classic example of putting a man on the moon. We had no computer technology, never endeavored to do anything like it. In 9 years, we put human beings on the moon with less computer capacity than any of your cell phones in here. And we did that because we wanted to. There has been an enormous amount of achievement because we thought we could, without regard for, well, it's problematic, well, it's difficult, well, it's challenging. Right? And that's been very, very useful. The fact that it's easy to come back after bankruptcy in the United States, to the fact that we have this unbending optimism, has worked to our advantage. Companies, but it's also problematic. Companies have to report every month. Take just a simple thing like this. Japanese companies report every 6 months. American companies report every month. That means you have a constant chasing of bottom line to report to your stockholders, which prevents long-term planning. A lot of companies are now moving away from this because they have realized the absurdity of not being able to plan long-term and say, we're going to invest in something that 2 years down the line is going to pay off significantly without fearing to scare off investors. It's just a simple thing like that is indicative of a greater sort of focus in society, right? And that may be a problem. It also goes to the fact that history in the United States, ancient history in the United States, is something that happened 50 years ago. Go to Spain, you start talking about ancient history when you start talking about the 11th or 12th century. Up until then, it's recent. So the perspective is different. It's sometimes very, very useful to have this disregard for problems, and it has worked very well for the United States. But to disregard problems of skills in a time when you're not building a railroad across the country that requires physical labor. You're not building an interstate system that requires physical labor and very simple material. But instead, you're designing the next supercomputer, the next robot, the next intelligent spacecraft. When you're doing that, you need more than an unending optimism. You actually need skills. The first actual thinking, speaking, walking human robot with cognitive skills was just launched in Korea, playing table tennis, answering questions, and conversing. The first fully interactive arm that responds to your cognitive senses and goes through your arm out and moves your fingers was created in England. So others are obviously recognizing this, right? And it's not just engineers. These are teams of sociologists, political scientists, engineers, software programs, etc. In Estonia, you learn programming from the age of 6. Just like you learn a second language, you learn programming from the age of 6. That means when they're 13, they can write the software programs that master's students do in the United States. Those are the people you are competing with. No, this is the reality of the world. There's nothing to say that you can't. But this is the reality of the world we live in. And we have every advantage in the United States. We just need to make sure that people like yourselves take advantage of it. Yes, Matthew. So we put our energy into entertainment and military. Yes? Military research came up with the internet, with microwave technology, with interchangeable turbines. Sorry, what? Well, yes. Both of you bring up good points. Yes, we put priorities into it, but also remember that with every priority made, like with the military, we do get benefits as well. The research in DARPA, the Defense Department's research is enormously valuable. We all benefit on a daily basis from the technologies and the innovations that come out of the Defense Department's research. Absolutely. But it made us, and actually, if you think about this, you may not think of it as database. The fact that more Iranians watch American shows, the fact that it's popular in areas where our politics are not, actually benefits us. The fact that Baywatch was the most popular show in Iran actually benefits us because it enables those whose governments and I'm not saying this lightly, it's actually a lot of psychological research and surveys that show this. Americans are more popular in Iran, whose government hates us, amongst the general population, than in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, who we ally with, cuddle with, and buy oil from. Because they differentiate between the government and the people. That's actually a very good part of soft power, of attractiveness that we have. Our entertainment, our education. Why do all of the dictators in the world send their kids and their supporters' kids to the United States and Britain? Yes, exactly. Exactly. So the spread of these, what you consider to be somewhat less important areas, are actually good for us internationally, creating goodwill. But at the same time, there are other areas, as correctly pointed out, that we don't emphasize as much domestically. Absolutely. Two of the films we watched were on healthcare. I don't believe there's a single topic in the United States, perhaps rivaling immigration, that is more full of myths, misperceptions, distortions, lies, and utter nonsense than healthcare. And this is completely irrespective of whether or not you support a government-run healthcare system, totally private system, combination. Completely irrespective of that. It is an absolute farce. And I can attest, when the Obama administration presented its healthcare law, I spent a lot of time in Europe working on the latest book. And the headlines in Belgium, in Germany, in England, in Sweden, in Finland, you could have taken comic strips and posted them in terms of the debates in the United States. You're debating something that every human being needs, and the arguments being made would fit a Donald Duck series. And we're discussing your future, your costs, our lives. And so when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about healthcare, talking about education, I think it behooves us, and that's also why you're in college, to learn to think, to assess, not to agree with everything I say, but to assess the arguments being made about what's actually factually correct. Is it good that American companies have to pay health care, an undue burden that none of their competitors from the rest of the world have to pay? At the same time, is it helpful that in the United States, not having health insurance is the biggest disadvantage to you succeeding? You have airborne illnesses and diseases popping up again that were eradicated and do not exist in any other developed country. Rickets down in Louisiana, it's because of vitamin deficiency in the biggest industrialized country in the world. So when we talk about immigration, as we mentioned before, healthcare and others, at least the facts have to be on the ground. The facts have to be assessed. And then you can disagree on how to reach outcomes. Because just like there's no single democracy in the world that is identical in its institutional setup to another democracy. Germany's just as free as England or Sweden or France, but they're set up very differently. Same in the United States. So are healthcare systems. So this notion that there's just either a universal system where the government pays everything to taxes or it's all private market is complete lunacy. You can look at any country's healthcare system in the richest 35 countries in the world, and none of them have identical systems. But all of them cover everyone, except for us. Critics would say, well, we do, because you can go to the emergency room. Well, if Matthew has insurance and I don't, and I go to the emergency room, Matthew's going to pay for me. So that ends up being a cost that we all bear anyway. So we at least have to have an honest debate about this. And this is not going to go away because under the current, just like with immigration, the current healthcare law does not in any way, shape, size, or form contain costs or cover everyone. Not at all. And again, that's irrespective of whether you believe that we should have universal coverage, whether you believe government should pay for it all, or whether it should be privately paid. But think about this. It says the following. Who pays for the military, the armed forces' health care? Who does? Let's see. Who does? Taxes? Government, right. Who pays for health care for senior citizens? Taxpayers. Government. Who pays for the roughly 25 million on Medicaid, the government program for the poorest? Taxpayers. Who pays for health care for state, local, and federal employees? Taxpayers. So about 100 million Americans already have government-paid health care. So just one fact in the debate. But we have no real discussion on alternative means of which to provide. And again, as I said, nobody looks to the United States for immigration reform today. Nobody looks to the United States as an example of how to do high school and middle school. But I can assure you, from mayors in Lehigh Valley to governors of states to congressional representatives, they've gone to Finland, they've gone to South Korea, they've gone to Poland to look at high schools. When it comes to healthcare, nobody looks to the United States. When Taiwan and Chile were to set up, the latest of the developed countries set up their healthcare systems, they looked at the United States, scoffed, and looked elsewhere. So we've gone from being really, really, really good in these areas and still having a lot of advantages to having serious problems that we need to address. And you're the population who are going to have to decide this. Your age group. What do we want to do? How do we want to do it? Because the next 20 years, we'll get by. We'll get pensions. Healthcare won't collapse. The roads will be passable. We'll have enough births to produce enough people. But after that, it doesn't look too good. Now, we've managed to reform ourselves before. The question is what we will do in the future. At what point will that, those changes come? And remember, you're under 25 today. You're in the least participatory, least active group of voters. Yet you're the most vulnerable, you're the most affected, and you're the most, the biggest group that will have to deal with competing in the workforce and taking care of your health and getting a pension later on. So these are real issues that has to do with distribution of resources and ideas, all the things that we've talked about thus far. Other comments, questions? Yes, Graham. Why would it have problems in 20 years? It's a rough estimate because given how many people currently do not work and don't have jobs, how many people are dropping out of education, given the rising cost of healthcare, the projection is that the system can barely cope until that time, but at that point, within a couple of decades, we will reach the limit as to what we can tolerate and pay for. In other words, what this is sufficient money for. And at that point, we've already crowded out most infrastructure improvements and other programs. So it comes to a point where you have to decide. Now, the argument is that if we make changes now, like we did with welfare reform 20 years ago, or when we previously reformed the tax code in the early 1980s, we can make small changes and make it solvable and solvent, and you can all enjoy a better future. But it still takes ideas, willingness, and some compromise. And these are not issues that are going to go away, because unlike in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, where you didn't have the internet, you didn't have mobility, you didn't have technology flowing across borders. You didn't have global trade. You didn't have global mobility. You didn't have to compete with the rest of the world on equal level. Today you have to. And the two oceans on each side are not the barriers they used to be. So you put those two things together, the problem becomes greater. But there is an unwillingness on both the left and the right in the United States to acknowledge what a lot of people in a lot of other countries had to acknowledge, that we're doing some things well, but we're doing some things really poorly, and we need to change, or we're going to suffer a lot. There's no doubt that we have the resources. You're sitting here as a future, educating yourself, learning to think critically and write and assess arguments. More need to do that. At the same time, we have resources from gas and oil and timber and land that is attractive to the rest of the world. The question is, how do we use it? And ultimately, it doesn't matter if we produce 10,000 more millionaires a year, because they can only buy so much, sleep in so many beds, and eat so many meals. The real question is, what happens to the middle 60, 70% who buy cars, clothes, foods, go on vacations, invest in pensions? Without those, it's really, really difficult to have a flourishing society. And that's the real problem. Yes? How do you address problems? Well, that's part of you're here learning about politics and society. You're learning to think and critically assess. You're learning the importance of being involved in society, and you're getting the skills of how to do so. Many other people before have done things like, first of all, show up the polls, because people have different visions. People may argue that the Democrats and Republicans are very similar in the views. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But at least you owe yourself to look at the candidates and say, who would better have, who do I agree with more in terms of where they want to take society? And do I think they have a chance of doing so? Because elections have turned society. You can look through American history and they have. Organizations and lobbying groups. The great benefit of democracy is you can join groups that advocate on your behalf. Senior citizens have AARP. Businesses have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Unions have labor organizations. There are youth groups out there that are active with elected officials, with companies, that are doing great things at the local and state level where most of this impact is. So they're joining organizations that cater to your ideas is another avenue. If it's your preference to get involved in politics or business, there are plenty of organizations to do that as well. But so there are different ways. One person can't change all society most often, but many people together can. Whether it's further towards individualism, further towards collectivism, a mix of the two, if it's all on immigration or all on healthcare, whatever it may be, we're certainly not the same as we were in the 1950s, and some people obviously did something to change that. So we have changed before by people getting involved in groups and managing change. There's no reason why we shouldn't again. And we've had elections. We've had elections where entire groups of Republicans and Democrats have been voted out, both at the state and local and federal level. So those are some good places to start if you want to make a change. But perhaps equally important for all of you, you learn to critically think when you're in college. So when you discuss with friends, neighbors, parents, siblings, others, and you hear things that you really think are fanciful or dumb, don't get upset. Just counter with some facts. I mean, that's what you hear. Or say, let's look this up. Let's see if it's actually true. That's an invaluable skill. Because if half of the people espousing some of the things they do on radio and TV to grab headlines actually did that, we would have a very different debate in the United States. Yes, Matt? Yes, it's scary. You're absolutely right, it's scary. Well, millions of people around the world want to come to the United States. There must be some reason for that. As well, yeah. Well, we have universities, energy, and innovative companies. And with some small steps, we can change all that to very, very successful pension systems, immigration, and healthcare. If you give up the hope that we can, aren't you just saying that we're not good enough? Okay, if we feel more hopeless, then let me counter you with this. If we could get over a civil war, if we could get over endless warfare abroad, if we could get over massive depression, if we could get over indefensible racial segregation, if we could get over the terrorist threat, which we've contained to a nuisance, I mean, you are still more likely to be hit by lightning than be a victim of terrorism in the United States. And so if we got over that, there seems to be some willingness to work. And in theory, whether it's 2 million Iranians, Turks, Germans, and Australians that do it in the United States, or whether it's 2 million Americans, third generation, that do it, doesn't really matter. If it happens within our borders and people get more jobs, I can leave you with an encouragement. If you want, this week, as we speak, and we'll talk about this later, but 60% of the world, 60% of the world's wealth are engaged in trade and investment negotiations in Europe and the United States, and the United States and 11 other trans-Pacific countries, Chile, Mexico, Japan, and a few others. That would create over 1 million jobs, estimates have. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And it will create over 1 million jobs, making life easier for people and more affordable simply by removing regulations and tariffs. That's one way in which we can improve on the current situation if it gains support in Congress and in other countries' legislators. But the arguments there are the same as they are in healthcare, on immigration, on education. People have different ideas of what they will lead to, different ideas of how good they are, different ideas of what should be in them. You're never going to get away from that in democracy. Democracy is the most difficult thing to govern on earth, because people have different ideas of how to achieve good outcomes. But if you stop trying, and if you start resorting to distortions rather than facts, and it's incumbent upon graduates from college to actually emphasize facts rather than distortions, if you stop doing, if you give up on that, then you're definitely not going to have a functioning democracy. And that I don't think anyone would put up with, or would want, rather. Okay?